You are looking at SSH login attempts to a brand new virtual private server that I just created. And if you have your own VPS and you haven't taken the steps to lock it down, try running this command to see if there are login attempts happening. And you'll be surprised at what you find, because there are hackers running automated scripts 24/7 trying to find and exploit vulnerable servers, and you don't want to be a victim of this. Now in this video, I'm going to show you the basics of setting up and locking down a VPS to prevent these login attempts and automatically block other types of attacks as well. Now, this will be the first video in a series on self-hosting with the VPS. So if this kind of thing interests you, let us know in the comments, and also stick around for future videos in the series where we take this VPS and turn it into a web server or a database server. Now, whether you're a complete beginner, a hobbyist, or a developer that wants to start managing their own servers, this video will show you everything you need to know to create a secure, locked-down VPS that's ready to run any service you throw at it. So let's jump in. I'm CJ, welcome to Syntax. Now, if you're new to the world of VPSs, welcome. There are a lot of things you can do with them and a lot of reasons why you would want to manage one yourself. Now, a VPS is just one way to host things on the web. If you're interested in learning about more, check out episode 615 of Syntax, where Wes and Scott compare the different kinds of hosting and the various providers. Now, like I mentioned, you can do a lot of things with a VPS, and one of the reasons people typically start learning about and looking into VPSs is to self-host. Things like a personal media server like Plex, Jellyfin, or Emby, or host their own cloud with something like Nextcloud, or host photos with something like PhotoPrism, or host your own password manager with like Bitwarden or Passbolt. But you can also self-host your own applications and web services, things like a custom Discord bot, or some long-running process, or like a WebSocket server, or self-host your own instance of Sentry. You could also run web servers like Nginx, Apache, or Caddy. You can host databases like MySQL, Postgres, MongoDB, or Redis, and others, and ultimately reduce your dependency on managed services like Vercel, Netlify, Heroku, Render, Railway, Fly.io, am I missing any? And also manage database services like AWS, RDS, PlanetScale, Neon, and others. Now, in episode 730 of Syntax, Wes and Scott talk about some of these PaaS, or Platform as a Service alternatives. They talk about things like Piku, Doku, Kubero, Caprover, Coolify, probably a couple others, and these all allow you to get the same functionality as Vercel or Netlify, but running on your own server. Now, managing a VPS is not for the faint of heart. It requires constant attention and maintenance, which is why managed services exist, and why this type of thing is typically a full-time job. But if this kind of thing still interests you, let's get into it. Now, the next part of this video will assume that you want to set up a VPS and you have acquired one. So like I mentioned, check out episode 615 of Syntax if you'd like to know where to get one and more about these various hosting providers. Now, I'm going to be setting up a tiny VPS. It's running Ubuntu 22.04. It has 1 gig of RAM, 1 CPU, and 10 gigabytes of disk space. Now, this video is not sponsored by any VPS hosting or domain provider, so I'm going to keep things fairly generic so you can use whatever you can afford and whatever you prefer. Now, depending on the type of workload you're going to be running on this VPS, you might need better specs. But for me, I'm going to have a few static sites, a few Node.js applications, and a couple databases, so the minimal specs that I mentioned will work for what I need to do. Now let's connect to our VPS. For this, we're going to use a thing called SSH, and you're going to need a terminal to do this. Now on a Mac, I am using an app called iTerm. You can also use the built-in terminal on a Mac. If you're on Windows, there's a thing called Windows Terminal. If you're on Linux, just search for the app called Terminal and open it up. And we're going to want to run the command SSH. So once it's open, we're going to type SSH, and then we'll need to type the username that has been set up for us on the VPS. Now, this is going to vary by where you got your VPS. For me, the VPS username is root, and we're going to log in with that. Yours might be admin or Ubuntu or Debian. It might vary, but for me, it's root. And then after the @ sign, we're going to put in the IP address of our server. Now, this IP address will be listed in whatever dashboard of wherever you got your VPS, but this is a public IP address. And that means anyone in the world that's on the internet will be able to access the server at this IP address, just like we're about to access this server. Now you should have a command that's SSH username at IP address, hit enter, and now it's going to attempt to connect. Now the first time you're ever connecting to a server, you're going to see this warning, and here you can just type yes. And what this is doing is it's storing the fingerprint of this server on your computer, so the next time you connect, it's going to validate that fingerprint. Now, the next time you connect, you shouldn't see this warning. And if you ever see this warning again and you haven't changed anything on the server, then that means something has gone wrong. Something is potentially compromised. Like the SSH key on the server has actually changed. And sometimes there's a legitimate reason for that. But just so you know, you should only see that warning the first time you connect to the server, and you shouldn't see it anytime after that. Now we'll need to type in our password. Now, as you type, you're not going to see anything on the screen here in the terminal, but as long as you type everything correctly, you should get connected to your server. Now, one of the first things you should do when you connect to your VPS for the first time is run updates and upgrades. So like I mentioned earlier, I'm running Ubuntu 22.04, so all of these commands will work if you're on an Ubuntu or Debian-based system. Now, depending on what your VPS has set up for you, if you are not connecting as the root or super user, then all of these commands you're going to need to type sudo in front of. So like sudo apt upgrade or sudo apt install. For me, because I'm running as the root user, I will not need to put sudo in front of those commands. But if you try running those commands and it says you don't have permission, put sudo in front of them. So the first thing we're going to do is just say apt update. Now this command isn't going to actually upgrade anything. It's just going to update the package lists locally on your machine. So when you do run an upgrade or you do run an install, it's always grabbing the latest versions from those specific repositories. So now that we have the latest package list, you can see that it says 76 packages can be upgraded. So we're going to run the upgrade command. So I'll just do apt upgrade. And that's going to grab and install all of the latest versions of all of the packages that I have installed. Now we can confirm this with Y, and it'll start downloading and upgrading everything. Now, you might be wondering, why are we upgrading? One of the ways to keep your VPS secure is to always be running the latest versions of all packages. Because when hackers attempt to gain access to a machine or exploit a machine, typically they're taking advantage of old broken versions. And so anytime a package has an upgrade, a lot of times it's potentially a bug fix or a vulnerability fix. And so we always want to make sure we're always running the latest versions of all packages, just to make sure that we always have the latest fixes and patches for anything that we're using on our system. Now, when you run this upgrade, you may or may not see this notice that there is a pending kernel upgrade. Now, the kernel is like the root of the operating system, and this is another thing that could potentially be vulnerable. So we always want to be running the latest version of the kernel. Now, if you upgrade the kernel, you are going to have to restart the machine, which is why we typically want to run these commands before we do anything else on the VPS, because we're going to need to reboot it a few times before we can start running our own applications. So I am going to do the kernel upgrade here, and then from there, we'll likely restart our machine. Now, this is asking me what services should be restarted. Like I said, we are going to restart the entire machine, so we actually don't really even have to worry about this. I can just OK through it, because once we reboot the whole machine, then all of these services will be restarted anyways. Now that all of the upgrades have run, and in my case, I also upgraded the kernel, you can do this to determine if you need to reboot. So if you do an ls of /var/run/reboot required, if that exists, that means your machine needs to be rebooted. And there are different ways to do this. You can actually do this from the command line if you just type reboot, but you can also do it from your VPS dashboard. And that's how I'm going to do it, just because I want to make sure that this thing actually reboots. Because if you accidentally shut down the machine and there's no way to restart it in your dashboard, you're going to have to reach out to the support team of wherever you're hosting your VPS. So for my VPS, there's a dashboard where I can literally say restart VM. So I am going to exit from my SSH session here, go to my dashboard, and restart the VPS. Now that the machine has rebooted, we're going to SSH back in. And once you're in, you shouldn't see system restart required. That's a good sign. And also, if it says 0 updates can be applied immediately, you should be good to go. But since I upgraded the kernel, it's likely that some more packages can be upgraded as well. So we're actually going to do an apt upgrade again. Now, in my case, it says there are a couple of packages that have been kept back and it didn't auto-install them. So I'm actually just going to try to install them directly. So I'm going to copy their names and then just do an apt install with those names. Now, you may not have gotten that error, and that's completely fine. If it says you have no upgradable packages, you're good to go. But at this point, because I did install those, if I do an app upgrade now, I should see there's nothing to be upgraded, which means I'm on a fully upgraded system. Now, the next thing I'll do is change the root user's password. Now, for me, in my VPS dashboard, they literally gave me a password that I could copy paste to log in as the root user. And I don't want to be able to do that. So I'm going to change it to something that only I know and something that can't be copy pasted from the dashboard. So if you type PASSWD, that will prompt you to change the password for the currently logged in user. In this case, I'm going to change the password of the root user. Now, you won't see anything when you're typing your password, but as long as you type it correct both times, it'll change the password. Now, to check it, I'll exit the SSH session and re-log in with my new password. So I've confirmed my updated password works. Now we can start locking down the server. And one of the first concepts you'll learn in security is the principle of least privilege. And if we're running all of our commands as root, we always have super user privileges. If you type ID in the terminal and your user ID is 0, that means you are the super user. You can do anything on this machine. And there are some things we need super user privileges for, but we don't need it for everything. So we're going to create a secondary user, and they will not have super user permissions by default, but we'll be able to run things with super user permissions if they require it. Now, to add a new user, we can use the add user command. So I'm going to type add user and then the name of the user. In this case, I'm going to call it CJ because that's me. So this will create the user and it's going to ask for a password. Now, give it a password, but give it a different password than the root user. You don't want those passwords to be exactly the same for security purposes. So I'm going to give this a password now. After you set up the password, it'll ask you a few more questions. Just fill those out. And for some of these, you can just leave them blank if you don't have any info for them. Now that we've created the user, they're a regular plain old user. They can't do anything as the super user yet. But what we'll do is we'll add them to a group called sudo, and that will then allow them to perform super user actions if they need to. So to do this, we're going to do a user mod. We'll do -a -G, and then we will specify sudo and then the username. In this case, my username is CJ. Now from here, if we want to make sure it worked, we can type groups and then the name of the user, and we'll see the groups that they're in. So by default, a user is always in a group with their own name. So I'm in the CJ group, but you can see that we've added that sudo group as well. So now to try this out, let's actually exit our SSH session as root and try logging in as this new user that we created. So I'm going to exit. We're going to do an SSH, but now instead of logging in as root, we're going to type the username that we just created. We'll type in the password and we're good to go. So now we are able to log into the machine, but not as the root user. And like I said, this is one of the first steps of locking down the machine, is making sure that you're not always doing things as the root user. Now you can see that Ubuntu is actually being very helpful right now, and it's saying if you want to run something as the administrator or as the super user, you can use the sudo command. So for example, if I tried running an app update like we did when we were under the root account, you'll see this error, and basically that means we don't have permissions to do it. But if I'd like to perform this action as the super user, I can do sudo apt update. Now it's going to ask for your password the first time, and this is your user password. So just type that in. And from there, it will run the command with super user privileges. Now you can use this sudo command for any command that you want to run as the super user. Now, if you're new to Linux and the sudo command, you are basically unlocking the ability to understand this classic XKCD joke of if you put sudo in front of any command, you now are executing it as the super user. And sudo used to stand for super user do, but now the command can also be used to run commands on the machine as other users as well. So it actually stands for substitute user do, and it allows you to perform commands as other users. And by default, it'll perform the commands as the root user. Now, the next step in locking down the machine is making it so that we connect with an SSH key instead of a password. Now, to do this, you will need an SSH key. I'm going to link this article by GitHub in the description. It shows you how to generate an SSH key if you don't have one, but the next steps will require you to have an SSH key. Now, it's important to note that SSH key that you generate should be generated on your local machine, the machine that you're going to be connecting to the VPS from, not on the VPS itself. So make sure when you follow the directions to generate the SSH key, it's happening on your local machine. Now that SSH key locally on your machine lives in your home folder in a folder called .ssh. And for me, this is the public key file. And if we run the cat command on it, we can see the contents of it. Now, this is completely okay to share because this is my public key. I would not want to share the private key, which is in the file without the .pub on it. But the public key, completely okay to share, and this is what we need to add to the server to be able to log in using this SSH key. Now let's add this public key to the VPS. So I'm going to copy my public key, and then over on the VPS, I need to create a folder in my home folder called .ssh. So right now I'm in my home folder. I'm going to make a directory called .ssh, and then I need to create a file called authorized_keys. Now to do this, I'm going to use a command line tool called Nano. It's very easy to use. Basically, it's a command line text editor. And then I'm going to specify the file name. So I want to edit the file called .ssh/authorized_keys. Now, once I'm in here, this is just a text editor. I can type whatever I want, but I need to put my public key into this file. So I'm going to paste it in, and then I'm going to exit and save the file. So you can see in Nano, it literally tells us to exit. We can press Control X, And then to save it, we'll press Y and then hit enter. So now my public key is in that authorized key file. And that's actually all we need. If I exit my session here and then try SSHing back in, you'll notice it doesn't ask for my password and just instantly logs me in. And this is because behind the scenes, it was doing a public-private key negotiation and allowed me to log in with my SSH key. Now that we've set up our SSH key, we are going to disable password login entirely. And this is how we're going to stop attackers from trying a bunch of different passwords, is no one will be able to log into our server with a password. You have to use an SSH key once we enable this setting. Now, it's important to note, if you're connecting to this VPS from other computers, you're going to need to make sure that you set up an SSH key on those machines as well, and you add the public key to that authorized keys file that we worked on earlier. But at this point, let's disable password login. Now, to disable password login, we're going to need to edit the SSHD config. We'll use sudo for this because we need super user privileges to edit that file. We'll use nano because it's a text file, and the file is at /etc/ssh/sshd_config. Now, we'll edit this file, and because we're using sudo, we'll have to type in our user password. Now, once we're in the file, we can hold the down arrow to get to the section on password authentication. Now, I will note that in the previous section, I said that login with SSH key would just work. If it's not working for you, it's possible that this setting was not set to yes. So make sure that you set this setting to yes. But we're looking for the password authentication setting. So yeah, right now password authentication is set to yes. I want to set this to no and then save the file. Now on my machine, there's actually another config that I need to update, and that is in the .d folder. So if we take a look in that folder, there's also sshd_config.d. And inside of there's a cloud init file. And this file actually also has password authentication set to yes. So I want to make sure that I set this one to no as well. So we'll save that, update it. And now we need to restart the SSH service to get these settings to kick in. So I'm going to do sudo service SSH restart. Now to test if this worked, let's actually try logging in as the root user. So I'm going to SSH in as root. And if we get this error, permission denied public key, we know that it's working because we didn't set up a public key for the root user. We only set it up for our other user. And now we actually can't log in with a password as the root user. But if we try SSHing in as the user we created, the public-private key exchange should happen and we should get logged into the machine. Now, we've locked things down so we can only log in via an SSH key, but to lock things down even further, we're going to prevent login via the root user over SSH entirely. So to do this, we'll jump into that same config file. We're going to go down to the section that says permit root login, and we're going to remove the hash which will actually enable this configuration. By default, without password just means that it would only allow the public-private key authentication for the root user, but we're actually just going to set this to no, and that way the root user cannot log in via SSH at all. So we'll save this file, and then we'll restart the SSH service. So we'll do sudo service SSH restart. And from here, root can no longer log in via SSH. Now, the next step in locking down your VPS is to control the network and firewall policy. Now, for me, my VPS provider has a dashboard where I can open and close various ports on the firewall. You might have that as well. You're going to want to look for a section called ports or firewall or network. But if you don't have that section in your VPS provider dashboard, you can actually use an application firewall. So built into Ubuntu is an application called UFW, or uncomplicated firewall. And it allows you to control the firewall from the command line directly on the VPS itself. But since my provider has a dashboard where I can control all of the ports and everything, I'm going to be using that for all of this network stuff that I talk about. Now, the first thing we'll do is close all ports that don't need to be open. Now, if you're new to all of this stuff, ports are like little doorways on your computer that can receive and respond to network requests. And so, for example, we've been connecting to our VPS via SSH, and by default, the SSH service is running on port 22 to respond to those SSH requests. Now, if you're not running anything else on your machine that needs to be exposed to the internet, like you don't have a web server or you don't have a database or anything else, you can just close down all other ports. So either use UFW to do this from the command line or go into your VPS provider dashboard, and any ports that it has open, Like a lot of times port 80 and 443 will be open by default because the provider assumes that you're going to be running an HTTP or HTTPS service, and those services respond on those specific ports. But if you're not going to have a web server there, you can close those ports. So just remove those rules that open up those ports. Or if you're using UFW, use it to either open or close those ports. Now, one of the common things people do to lock down a machine further is change the port that SSH is running on. Now, we mentioned it runs on port 22, but you could run it on 2222 or 4242. You could pick a port number. And to do that, you would need to go into your firewall, whether it's in a dashboard or it's from the command line, and open up the port that you want to run SSH on. And then you can go into that configuration file that we were in earlier, and there's actually a section that will let you set the port that SSH runs on. Now, if you do this, this is one way of preventing automated attacks against your server, because a lot of scripts that hackers are running will assume that SSH is running on port 22 if port 22 is open. So if you close 22 and run SSH on a different port, that's going to prevent those automated attacks. Now, there are ways of poking and prodding at a server to figure out what ports are open, and if any ports are open, attempting to figure out what services are running on those ports. So a savvy hacker will still be able to find your SSH port even if you change it from the default 22. Now, personally, I like the convenience of not having to type in the port number when I SSH, so I just leave SSH running on port 22. But again, this is one way of locking down the server if you want to prevent those automated login attempts. Now, you can further lock down these ports by restricting access to specific IP addresses. Now, by default, if you're setting up a rule and it has the IPv4 address 0.0.0.0, that means allow and respond to requests from any IP address. But let's say, for instance, you only want to allow access to port 22 from your computer that you're running right now. If you have a static IP address, that means an IP address that doesn't change, you can set up that firewall rule so that it only allows connections from your IP address. Now, I don't have a static IP address. I'm just running home internet. And so day to day, my IP address might change. But if you're at a business or you're paying your internet service provider for a static IP address, then this is a kind of rule that you can set up where basically in the rule, instead of 0.0.0.0, you put your IP address, and now your server will only allow connections on that specific port from the IP address that you specify. Now that things are locked down, we're going to want to make sure that our system stays up to date. And so for this, we're going to install a program called unattended-upgrades. So from the command line, if you do sudo apt install unattended-upgrades, this will install it. Now, my system came pre-configured with it, but if yours didn't, you're going to need to install it. From here, we're going to enable automatic updates. So you do sudo dpackage-reconfigure unattended-upgrades. This will run a little configuration wizard. You just want to say yes on enabling automatic upgrades. Now, from here, you're good to go, but you might want to customize it some more. So I'll link to the documentation in the description, but you'll notice that they talk about a specific config file that you can modify. So if we take a look at this, there are some settings inside of there, like the kind of updates that should be applied, and also further settings like should the machine be automatically rebooted and stuff like that. So if you say sudo nano and then the location of that file, you can edit it. Now, by default, only security updates are enabled. So these two lines here and these two lines here are for security updates. But if you want to automatically update other types of packages as well, you can uncomment these lines. So if you remove these two slashes, that actually makes it so that this line will be matched whenever it's running the automatic upgrades as well. So I'm going to do this for updates because this will just update regular packages as well. Now, like I said, there are other options in here. I'll link the Git repo that talks about the other kinds of options, but there are options in here also for things like automatically rebooting, picking what time the server should reboot. You can also set up mail so that it sends you an email if there are updates that need to happen, these kinds of things. Now from here, we want to make sure that the service is running. So if I do a sudo systemctl status for unattended upgrades, as long as you see this output with a little green dot there, then that means the service is running in the background and it will be automatically installing updates. Now at this point, you can do whatever you want on your VPS. You can open ports, you can install services, it's yours to do what you would like. Personally, I'm a web developer, so in the next video in this series, I'm going to set up this machine to be a web server. I'm going to set up some static sites. I'll have some Node.js APIs running. I'll have a couple of databases running inside of containers. I'll have reverse proxies set up with subdomains and also set up some SSL certificates. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, let us know in the comments, but also stick around for the next video in this series. That's all I have for you for now. If you enjoyed this, let us know in the comments. If there are some pieces that I missed, let us know in the comments as well. I absolutely want this to be a valid and secure resource for people that are setting up a VPS. So if I said anything wrong or you think things could be done better, let me know in the comments. I'll add them as corrections to this video. So that's all I got for now. I'll see you in the next one.